We often view nature as something to leave alone, an amoral landscape that will always be beyond our moral interference, because it just is. Nature is a vicious cycle of brutality and misery. The natural order is propped up on the most egregious of crimes. Constant and never-ending rape and murder. Barbaric cruelty and savagery. Animals suffer and toil all day, every day, simply because natural selection has endowed them with an intense aversion to death. They are enslaved by natural selection, and their work consists of endless toiling and suffering. Animals are free in nature, but not free in the way that we are. Their state of liberty is not balanced as ours is. Our freedom ends where the freedom of someone else begins. In the state of nature, you are free to do anything, but everyone else is also free to do anything. More specifically, they are free to do anything to you. In the natural world, the freedom to butcher is the freedom to be butchered. And that is very much the way it plays out. You butcher an animal, which butchered another animal, which butchered another animal, and then you get butchered by another animal, which will later be butchered by another animal. Nature is a beautiful thing, but it is also an incredibly barbaric and cruel thing. I think that nature is undeniably infested with what we would typically call immorality, a massive cycle of endless torment and terror. As fascinating and inspiring as it can be, I feel no hyperbole is necessary to label nature as the ultimate evil, the source of all evil and the embodiment of careless and constant amoral brutality. If one thing is evil, it is pain, and it is from nature that pain came to exist. In purely utilitarian terms, nature seems to be the location of far more pain than pleasure, which is more than enough to label it evil. Nature is evil. So, what are we supposed to do about it? This question is quite quickly answered with all manner of arguments. Some amount to meaningless drivel about leaving nature alone. Others take into account worthwhile considerations such as practicality and the risk of destabilizing ecosystems. In purely utilitarian terms, if we consider the pain of all creatures to be worthy of our consideration, the correct course of action is surely to destroy the entire planet as quickly and painlessly as possible, with no hope of life coming back. Utilitarianism is about minimizing pain and maximizing happiness. If we acknowledge that most creatures suffer far more than they feel happiness, we can quickly forget about the importance of happiness. Happiness becomes secondary to averting misery. In such a situation, the utilitarian will be inclined to focus on minimizing pain rather than maximizing pleasure. We can discard the good of happiness, as this is the only way to get rid of the far greater evil of pain. The logical conclusion of animal-inclusive utilitarianism is the ushering in of the apocalypse. This is the only way to end constant suffering and misery in the state of nature. Intentional, human-imposed apocalypse. Sometimes we are confronted with a situation where we must choose simply to remove pain, rather than to gain pleasure. Sometimes utilitarianism justifies an intentional and self-imposed apocalypse. Or does it? I want to know your thoughts. Should we interfere with nature? Is the immorality of the natural world something we should seek to address? If we care about suffering and misery, then how can we possibly turn our back on the massive amount of suffering and misery that occurs in the state of nature? Or should we just leave them to their endless suffering and stick to our own? I really don't know. The idea of interfering sounds absurd, but is it really? I don't think that it is quite as absurd as many of us may intuitively feel. Personally, however, I really haven't made up my mind on this issue. This issue is, in my view, one of the great ethical questions of our existence, and one we should be considering. As well as being an important real-world issue, it provides us with a unique chance to massively flesh out our moral ideas and understandings. One could say that morality only exists to serve us. The purpose of morality is to serve us. If morality leads to us wanting to sacrifice ourselves and everyone we care about, then perhaps it has surpassed its purpose and ceases to be valid. Animals get moral consideration, but only insofar as it serves us. This argument may rule out self-imposed extinction, but it could have frightening implications elsewhere. From a reciprocal point of view, we could reason that if we were future animals, we would rather have our ancestors killed, rather than be born into a life of suffering and torment in the state of nature. Reciprocity requires that we take into account the interests of others, if we want our own interests to be seriously considered, which any rational actor does. Reciprocity means we must consider the suffering and interests of these animals, but does it require us to end that suffering? It quite likely does, but that depends on your understanding of reciprocity. Morality is a very complex thing. We could also use a veil of ignorance style argument. Normally these arguments are human exclusive, but why not expand them to animals? Who would you rather be? An animal condemned to endless suffering in the state of nature, or a person who partakes in the most painless possible mass extinction? There are many ways of considering this moral question, and we should consider them all. I know some of you will think I am completely insane just for saying this, but I think this is an important thing that is worth talking about. Should we engage in moral intervention in nature, and if we should, then to what extent? This is a significant moral question, and one that requires our attention.